Hello all, and welcome to my brand new podcast entitled The Warsaw Ghetto, The Roles That Children Played. I'm your host, Sarah Champness, and I am so excited to create this podcast for you. Within this episode, I will introduce the Warsaw Ghetto and provide context to the stories I will tell. Next, I will do a deep dive into the role of children within the Warsaw Ghetto. Children within the Warsaw Ghetto played an important and interesting part during and after the war, and provide a new perspective on the story of the Warsaw Ghetto. We will look at primary and secondary sources on the narrative of children in the ghetto, with particular attention to the roles they played. I am also very excited to share audio from a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto, from my grandmother Doba Dresner, or Diana Albert as she became in the United States, who will provide a voice to the concepts we will discuss. As background to the Warsaw Ghetto, according to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, German authorities established a ghetto in Warsaw, the city with the largest Jewish population in Poland, in the fall of 1940. Conditions within the ghetto were dire, with extreme overcrowding, disease, starvation, and death. From July to September 1942, German SS undertook mass deportations from the Warsaw Ghetto to the Treblinka death camp, killing hundreds of thousands of Jews. In January of 1945, Soviet troops finally reached Warsaw, where they found only devastation and a fraction of the pre-war population. As for the children within the Warsaw Ghetto, it was impossible to avoid this desperation. Every day, children became orphaned, with the older ones having to take care of the younger ones in the stead of parents. These orphans often lived on the streets, living off of nothing more than what they could beg for. Many would freeze to death in the winter. Additionally, many would have to pause their education, and that lack of education mixed with desperate conditions would cause severe developmental issues. Despite this, children played an extremely interesting yet essential role within the daily life of the ghetto. Throughout this podcast, we will discuss the different aspects and roles of children's lives, including child smugglers and their part in survival, children's objects and how they symbolize something left behind, a parent's inability to protect their children, and orphanages within the ghetto. Without further ado, here is the very first episode of The Warsaw Ghetto, The Roles That Children Played. For many children in the Warsaw Ghetto, their survival was purely up to them, which sometimes meant that they also had to provide for their parents. As the first aspect of this episode of children's roles within the Warsaw Ghetto, we will explore their job as smugglers. Smaller children often help smuggle food and other supplies to their families by crawling through narrow holes in the wall that surrounded the ghetto. Henryk Lajawart, a Polish poet and contributor to the Oyneg Szabez project, an archival project within the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote a poem about child smuggling entitled The Little Smuggler. Over the wall, through holes and past the guard, through the wires, ruins, and fences, plucky, hungry, and determined, I sneak through, dart like a cat. At noon, at night, at dawn, in snowstorm, cold or heat, 100 times I risk my life and put my head on the line. Under my arm a gunny sack, tatters on my back, on nimble feet with endless fear in my heart. But one must endure it all, one must bear it all, so that tomorrow morning the fine folk can eat their fill. Over the wall, through holes and bricks, at night, at dawn, at noon, plucky, hungry, artful, I move silently like a shadow. And if the hand of destiny should seize me in the game, that's a common trick of life. You, mother, do not wait up for me. I will return no more to you. My voice will not be heard from afar. The dust of the street will bury the lost fate of a child. The only one request will stiffen on my lips. Who, mother mine, who will bring your bread tomorrow? In her oral testimony, my grandmother speaks on finding those narrow holes in the wall and working as a child smuggler. Here is her story.
And my brother and I became very wise about those holes in the walls, and we became smugglers. We would go to the villages surrounding that town and buy potatoes, bread, flour, whatever food we could. As heavy as it was, we would carry on our shoulders back at night. We would walk at night only. And we became very clever smugglers. We knew where the Germans were and where they would attack attack us and what food to buy and where to hide and all that. And we would buy whiskey and bring it to the peasants, and they would give us food, which was easier than money, so we'd get more food. And every time we come back, my father would sell the food where we could eat and save the money for a rainy day if we have to run away to pay the falls to keep us or something. And every penny we saved. Several times we were caught by the Germans and they beat us up, especially my brother because he was older. I remember he was many times bloody and I used to be worried about him all the time. And since we became smugglers, I really loved him so much that he was very close to me, more than my father and mother.
In both The Little Smuggler and my grandmother's interview, the idea of supporting their parents was mentioned. The poem reads, "You, mother, do not wait up for me. I will return to you no more." And later on, "Who, mother mine, who will bring your bread tomorrow?" This is from the perspective of a child who seemingly perished while attempting to smuggle food back into the ghetto, leaving their mother to find food on her own. My grandmother also speaks about bringing back the food she smuggled back to her father, who would sell as much food as he could spare and save every penny in case the money was needed to bribe someone in the future for safe passage. This money was eventually needed, but my grandmother was the only one who benefited from it. She talks about the fate of her brother as a smuggler and how she ultimately used the money from smuggling here.
After a few months of smuggling, we heard rumors that young boys especially were wanted to work for the Germans, and they would pay a nice amount of money and they would give food, bread and milk. So my brother volunteered to go to work. And I was too young, so they just took him. And when they took him, he never returned afterwards. A few months later, one of the young boys, a friend of his had went with him, came back. And when I asked him, my father asked him about my brother, he wouldn't talk. So we assumed he was killed. And about 2 or 3 months later, they came and they announced that they taking everybody to a concentration. Rumors were that they were taking everybody to a concentration camp. And since my father saved all the money from smuggling, and he heard some of our relatives, cousins, were running away, they were running over the wall and hiding in the woods. And my father told me to go with them and gave me all the money that he saved. And he said, if you can bribe some Polish family that would keep you, give them the money. So he gave me the money and I hid it in my coat with a pin and nobody knew. He said, do not tell anybody about it. And I did just as he said.
Malnutrition in the ghetto, among many other plagues, ran rampant. This meant that the work of child smugglers was extremely important to the livelihood of those in the ghetto, with often great risk to the children. In both stories, the child smuggler worked to provide for their families at great cost. My grandmother's brother, whose name was Alter and was also a child smuggler, ultimately sacrificed his life to bring in money from outside of the ghetto, a loss that my grandmother never recovered from. In that clip, my grandmother also discussed how her father told her to escape through the same narrow holes that she would smuggle from with the money that she had made, with that interaction being the last time that she saw her father. This story, as well as the mother from The Little Smuggler, also present another aspect of children's roles within the Warsaw Ghetto, that being the parents' inability to protect their children, which we will discuss next. Another aspect of how children lived within the ghetto was how oftentimes parents were unable to provide and protect their children from the realities of the ghetto. Many primary sources from the time discuss this idea, as well as the overall hopelessness of their situations, especially parents. In Voices from the Warsaw Ghetto by David Roskies presents a diary entry entitled, "What Can I Possibly Say and Ask For in This Moment?" dated August 1st, 1942, from a Warsaw Ghetto inhabitant and contributor to the Oyneg Chabez project named Gela Sechstein. Gela speaks about this feeling of hopelessness and despair for her child, writing, "Poised on the border between life and death, more certain that I won't live than that I shall, I wish to take leave of my friends and works. I seek no praise. I merely wish that some trace were made of my name and of my daughter, the talented little girl Margot Lichtenstein, who at 20 months shows some painting talent. A Jewish child, speaks fine Yiddish, and is mentally and physically well developed. Now I am calm. I must perish, but I have done my share. I am trying to preserve some trace of my works. Farewell, friends and comrades. Farewell, Jewish people. Don't allow such catastrophes to recur. Neither Gela or her daughter Margot survived. A parent's inability to protect their children within the Warsaw Ghetto is an often overlooked yet integral part to the story of children in the ghetto. As previously mentioned in the portion about child smuggling, children often had to take a role that no child should ever have to. Lajavart and Sechstein both discuss the relationship between a parent and a child, with the former taking a position of a child's duty to support their parents, and the latter taking a position that parents often couldn't support their children, much to their despair. Gela, in particular, asserts the hopelessness of having a child in the ghetto and the inability to protect them. No parent wishes to part from their child, and Gela writes down a description of her daughter, as if a way to stay with her in words. In her oral testimony, my grandmother speaks about parting with her father, whose name was David, after he realized he could not protect her from the imminent liquidation of the ghetto and impending death. He made the very difficult decision to send her on her own, a decision that ultimately saved her life. At these points in the interview, especially the parts where she discusses her brother and the last time she saw her father, my grandmother becomes audibly emotional, and you can hear the tape click off many times. I think she would agree that although this decision might indicate that her father could not protect her from the realities of the ghetto, it actually showed that he did possess the ability to protect her in sending her away. Her mother Yenta died in the ghetto a few years earlier from a quick bout of typhus. My grandmother does not speak much about her mother in the interview since she died when she was quite young. Her father, being her only parental figure, worked hard to protect my grandmother and her brother. I am figuring that she became too emotional to tell the story of her last moments with her father in her oral interview, but she once told my mother of the story of her escaping through the hole in the ghetto wall. This is how my mother, Helen, retells that story. She told me she remembers going through to the other side and seeing her father through a hole in the wall. He had sat down at the hole and was crying. She kept waving her hand at him to leave because she was afraid he would get caught, but he just sat there frozen and wept. It is the only time I have really witnessed my mother firsthand get choked up when she described these stories to me. Her voice cracked as she described the last time she saw her father and how his despondent face crying for his last child is seared in her memory. She was about 10 years old. In another selection from Voices from the Warsaw Ghetto, Roski's includes Yisker, 1943, written by another Oyneg Shabbos contributor, Rachel Auerbach. Auerbach writes this scene. The first to be rounded up were the beggars. All the unemployed and the homeless were gathered up off the streets. They were loaded into wagons on the first morning of the deportation and driven through the town. They cried bitterly and stretched their hands out or wrung them in despair or covered their faces. The youngest of them cried, "Mother, mother." And indeed, there were women to be seen running along both sides of the wagons, their head shawls slipping from their heads as they stretched their hands out toward their children, those young smugglers who had been rounded up along the walls. In other of the wagons, the captives look like people condemned to death who, in the old copper plate engravings, are shown being driven to the scaffold in tumbrils. Although many were not successful, in the face of death, parents still attempted to protect their children. The story of children and their parents within the Warsaw Ghetto is often categorized as calamitous, and that children often died as a result of their parents' lack of protection. But I believe that my grandmother and her father serve as an exception to that idea. It was exactly her father's protection that led to her survival. Next in this episode, we will discuss the importance of objects and what they mean to tragic events like this, and how 2 objects that my grandmother owned were her most valued possessions and inspired her to keep going. Objects from the Holocaust often symbolize something other than their literal meaning, and with objects that I will discuss, symbolizing something left behind or representing the past. In The Objects That Remain by Laura Levitt, Levitt discusses how objects associated with a trauma inform the way that we view that event. Specifically, she talks about how the sweatpants she was wearing when she was raped acted not as evidence for solving this crime, but as a symbol of the trauma. She connects this event to the objects left behind from the Holocaust, one being the sweater of child Holocaust survivor Christine Karen. The sweater, sewn by Karen's grandmother before the war, was worn by Karen throughout her entire experience hiding from the Nazis in the sewers of Lvov, Poland, and Levitt states that Karen survived wearing the sweater on her body, protecting her during those horrific months. For Christine Karen, that sweater symbolized the family she once had and her strength to survive. It was much more than a homemade green sweater. My grandmother speaks about similar objects in similar ways, describing them as her most valued possessions. As mentioned previously, my grandmother discussed how her father pinned the money she made to the inside of her coat when she escaped from the ghetto, a coat that belonged to her brother Alter. That coat, along with the one pair of shoes that she owned, were the last objects that she had of her past, a past that included her family. Throughout the interview, she brings up the coat and shoes several times, each time emphasizing their value to her. Here is a part of that story.
And when it got very dark, I took my only torn shoes, my coat, and which was very, very valuable to me, because I knew when the winter comes, you need those things. And in the summertime, you didn't care about clothes. And I walked. I packed my things again. This time she made me a nice dress, and I had a new pair of shoes, which I wore only to church. In the summertime, that's the only time I was barefoot. And I packed only my things. And I took off at night, because this woman had a nice house, not very rich, but much richer than in the village. Packed my shoes that she made me and bought me, and my dress, my old coat and torn shoes, and I decided to go to him.
At this part of the interview, my grandmother is retelling her experiences with her objects after the war had ended. She had been living with a restaurant owner in Warsaw in exchange for her work when she decided to find someone from her hometown to see if he had any information about her family. While telling this story, she discusses her old torn shoes and coat, as well as new objects that she was given throughout. She mentioned that she was given a new pair of shoes by this woman, shoes that she would only wear to church. Throughout the interview, my grandmother asserted that she wanted no part in being Jewish, and while pretending to be Catholic during the war, she truly believed in Christianity. The objects from her past, specifically the shoes, reminded her of the trauma she went through with losing her family and having to grow up at such a young age, something that she might have associated with being Jewish. With these new objects and her safety in being Catholic, being Jewish and her old shoes reminded her of that painful past. Her coat, however, belonged to her brother, and she clung to whatever she could to remember him. Much like Levitt and Karen, the objects that she had represented more than the purpose that they served. She also survived wearing the coat and those shoes and found strength in those objects, but they also illustrated her traumatic past. After escaping the ghetto, my grandmother found work as a shepherdess on a farm a few kilometers outside of Warsaw during the war, all while pretending to be Catholic. She speaks fondly about her discovery of a sort of sundial that she made out of watching the sun in the sky while working the fields. Here is her discussion of that object.
And after a while, I was afraid that we shouldn't get lost, so I learned about the sun. If I knew this was east, this was west, and I would never get lost. And then when I would return, I would learn how to I never knew about, I'd learn to make a clock. I would clear away after I draw the pictures, make a clock and write numbers, and I knew exactly what time it was. Now when I take my children to the beach, I always draw a clock and they said, forgot it.
This is the one point in the interview in which she mentions her present life, commenting that she still draws the same clock she used to draw as a shepherdess into the sand whenever she takes her children to the beach. While not a physical object, this clock reminds her of her past, even if traumatic, and is something that she has taken with her throughout the rest of her life and past Warsaw. The objects that my grandmother talked about in her interview provide a visual and physical marker to her traumatic experiences, and is something that we as listeners can draw relations to. Next, and as the last portion of this episode, we will discuss the role of orphanages within the Warsaw Ghetto and my grandmother's experience in them post-war. Lastly, orphanages provide a crucial part in the story of children within the Warsaw Ghetto, during and after the war. Perhaps the most notable orphanage story to come out of the Warsaw Ghetto is about Polish-Jewish educator Janusz Korczak, the director of an orphanage in Warsaw. He established the orphanage, called Dom Soro, in 1912, experimenting with the educational relationship with children as partners, rather than the teacher as the definitive authority figure. When the ghetto walls were constructed, the orphanage was forced to move to the Jewish section, and Korczak moved with the orphanage, fighting to maintain a home for these children. Although Korczak was offered safety past the ghetto walls, he remained with the children during the mass deportations to Treblinka, sacrificing his life to comfort the children as they faced the end of their lives. A teacher who trained with Korczak said this about his legacy. Everyone makes so much of Korczak's last decision to go with the children to the train, but his whole life was made up of moral decisions. The decision to become a children's doctor, the decision to give up a full-time medical practice and writing career to take care of poor orphans, the decision to go with Jewish orphans to the ghetto. As for the last decision to go with the children to Treblinka, it was part of his nature. It was who he was. He wouldn't understand why we were making so much of it today. The legacy of orphanages in the Warsaw Ghetto are often related to the story of Janusz Korczak and his selflessness in supporting the children who were orphaned. Although post-war, my grandmother also speaks fondly of her time in an orphanage. After experiencing what she had, the orphanage in Warsaw was the closest thing she had to normalcy in a very transitive period of her life. Much like all of the aspects about children's roles in the ghetto previously discussed, orphanages were unique experiences. Not every child in the Warsaw Ghetto was so lucky to be able to live in an orphanage, and having survived the war, my grandmother was fortunate enough to find herself in the safety of one. Although Korczak might not have understood the fuss about his sacrifices, my grandmother was a living testimony about how important those institutions were. In the following, my grandmother discusses some memories of her time in an orphanage.
They told the doctor to take me to Warsaw. They had an orphanage there where I would be, because all during the war I didn't go to school, where I would be educated and be with my own age, and it would be best for me. So he took me to Warsaw and left me in the Jewish community there where they were going to transport me to the orphanage. It was a big house that belonged to a Jewish family from America. They would come there for the summers, and it was really a very nice house. The house was covered completely with roses, which I remember, and sometimes beautiful. And in the back they had tennis courts and fields where the children played, and the house also was surrounded with a brick wall, and if anybody came in they had to ring the bell and the superintendent would come and open the door, and that was good for the orphanage because they were afraid that the Polacks should attack the Jews. When I came at first they found out that I had no education, so they hired a tutor, and I did several grades with a tutor, and finally I went to school, to elementary school, and I went to 5th grade, and I only had 1st grade when the war broke out, and I did very well, and pretty soon I was going to high school, and life in the orphanages was very nice. There were children from all over the world, from Russia, from Belgium, some children were there, and they were from every city. None of them had parents. And we would get our clothing from old clothing that the people from the United States sent, and we had 2 pairs of shoes, which were very, very well. The dress coated in that, but the shoes were very good. And they had a very nice library, and I remember I loved the books, and pretty soon I read almost every book that was available to me. I'd read all night, and, you couldn't read in the bedroom because there was one bedroom for everybody, like a hospital, all lined up, and food was enough, and it was good food. We had cake and bread and everything, and we'd go to the theater. Theater was free because we were orphanages, so the best place we'd see, and we'd go to the movies, and life was pretty good. Only we couldn't go to the theater if we were punished. strict in the elementary classes that you had to sit straight, and if you moved, you were hit with a ruler in the arm or put in the corner. So once the teacher left the classroom, and as soon as she left the classroom, I was on top of the desk and directing the whole class what to say and what to do. And as I was directing with the stick that she used to have, I hit the picture.
This is the first time in the interview where I had heard my grandmother speaking about her childhood that actually involved her acting like a child. Up until then, she had only worked towards her survival in any way that she could, including her experiences as a smuggler and a shepherdess. I smiled as I heard her retell the story about jumping on the desk and making fun of the teacher, as I could tell that was a memory that she really liked. She recollected stories of herself as a troublemaker and how school life worked, finally getting to be a child. Much like Korshak and Dom Sarot, the structure of this orphanage allowed my grandmother to maintain a sense of regularity, almost permitting her to pick up where she left off. She had only up to a first-grade education when the war began, and really had no experience in an educational institution. The orphanage gave her an opportunity to make friends, go to the theater, dance, learn, and a lot of other things, but most importantly, be a child. She would ultimately live in a few orphanages around Poland until her immigration to the United States in 1949, where she would be adopted by her father's older brother, Isaac, who thought of her as his own daughter. In conclusion, the roles that children played within the Warsaw Ghetto were plentiful and crucial. From smuggling to the relationship with their parents, to the objects they left behind, and finally to their positions in orphanages, children of the Warsaw Ghetto were presented with unique experiences. My grandmother was 7 when the war began and 13 when it ended, losing all of her most formative developmental years. Not only did the experience of children in the ghetto have immediate effects on them, lasting impacts of their time there can obviously be seen in survivors well into adulthood. My mother often speaks about the fact that she had never seen her mother throw out a pair of shoes or a coat once in her life. Coats and shoes that had been collected over decades filled the hallway closets, as if she were perpetually preparing for the next winter. Although not the same exact object associated with the traumatic event, all coats and shoes to her became a reminder of her past. My grandmother would also often share stories of her brother with me, never forgetting their time together as smugglers. She told me she used to dream that he had escaped his fate and lived a long, happy life past the ghetto walls. She wrote this speech about her childhood in the Holocaust about 30 years ago, which I will share with you now. For most of these terrible years during the Holocaust, I lived in silence. Silence served me well, while living in the Warsaw Ghetto, while hiding in the countryside. Survival so often depended on not being noticed. The ability to suppress tears, pain, and grief was born in silence. Silence was the language of my childhood. I might have talked after the war about my past, but the staff in the orphanage kept persuading the children to forget the suffering and look towards a better future. When I tried to talk again when I came to the United States with my uncle, who lost his first wife and 4 children, he and my aunt would say, "Do not think about your past. Time will heal everything." As time went on, I shied away from wartime memories. I stayed away from reading, viewing, and discussions of anything connected to the Holocaust. When the subject came up, I kept my silence. The task of building a new life and raising a family kept the issue for me at bay for many years. Yet the more I tried to remove this tragedy from my conscience, the more it would surface. Silence and refusal to recognize my tragic past did not prevent it from entering my daily life and thoughts. In time, I began to speak about my experiences, at first with other survivors. The next step was to bring our experiences to others, particularly the young. The only way to convey a senseless tragedy is to personalize it. I know that the young who hear my story are forever changed. But as I am getting older, I am beginning to mourn again. With the process of mourning comes a sense of acknowledgement of the past. Remembering alone is frightening. Remembering with others is healing. My grandmother, who became Diana Albert in the United States, would survive the Warsaw Ghetto, move to New York City in 1949, and get married to my grandfather in 1954. She would have 3 children, Susan, David, and my mother, Helen, who in total would give her 6 grandchildren, with me being the youngest. I have chosen to include a picture of me and her at my 3rd birthday party at our house in Little Neck, Queens in 2003, as this is the Diana that she would become known for, a loving mother and grandmother. Although she was a child survivor of the Warsaw Ghetto and serves as a voice to all the concepts I have introduced in this podcast, she is much more than a survival story. She is one of the few children that survived the hell that was the Warsaw Ghetto, an astonishing feat on its own. I was lucky enough to bear witness to her incredible story and see the person that she became, and now you can too. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that you have enjoyed this episode of The Warsaw Ghetto, The Roles That Children Played.